The humid air of Henderson Field carried the acrid smell of aviation fuel and death. As Lieutenant Colonel Harold Joe Bauer watched the last Japanese bomber disappear into the Pacific morning sky, it was August 7, 1942, and the young Marine aviator had no idea he was witnessing the opening moves of what would become the most brutal campaign in the Pacific theater. Blood still pooled in the coral dust where Seaman First Class James Johnson had fallen moments earlier, torn apart by shrapnel from a bomb that had missed the runway by mere yards. The assault on Guadalcanal had begun before dawn when the first wave of Marines from the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches of Red Beach under the command of Major General Alexander Vandegrift. The Japanese had been caught completely off guard. Their construction crews working on the airfield fled so quickly they left behind hot meals and still running machinery. What should have been a contested landing became an pellet walk through abandoned positions. But seasoned Marines, like Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, knew better than to trust easy victories in the Pacific. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's Task Force 62 had delivered over 11,000 Marines to the islands, shores in the largest amphibious operation yet attempted by American forces. The naval bombardment had been thunderous, but largely unnecessary. The Japanese garrison had numbered fewer than 3,000 men, most of them construction workers rather than combat troops. As Captain Charles Brush led his patrol through the abandoned Japanese positions, he marveled at the sophistication of the airfield construction. The enemy had been building something significant here, something that could threaten the entire Allied supply line to Australia. By nightfall, the Marines had secured the airfield and renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, who had died at Midway just 2 months earlier. Colonel Frank Goetsch established a defensive perimeter, while his intelligence officers examined captured documents that would prove both invaluable and horrifying detailed plans for Japanese expansion throughout the Solomon Islands chain. The abandoned meals were still warm in the mess tents, suggesting the enemy withdrawal had been hasty and unplanned. But as darkness fell over the jungle, strange sounds began to emerge from the dense tropical vegetation. The Marines had taken the airfield, but they had not taken Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, positioned his men along what would later be called Bloody Ridge and waited for whatever the night might bring. The Japanese had a reputation for nighttime counterattacks, and intelligence reports suggested significant enemy forces remained hidden in the island's interior. Private First Class John Bosselon checked his machine gun positions for the 3rd time as shadows began to move in the tree line. The easy victory of the morning felt like a lifetime ago, and every Marine on the perimeter could sense that their real test was yet to come. In the distance, the sound of ships' engines carried across the water, but whether they belonged to friend or foe remained terrifyingly unclear. The campaign that would determine the fate of the Pacific War had begun with deceptive simplicity. But as the tropical night descended over Henderson Field, 18,000 American Marines found themselves alone on a hostile island, 600 miles from the nearest friendly base, with an enemy whose capacity for violence they were only beginning to understand. The USS Astoria shuddered as Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser squadron unleashed hell upon the sleeping Allied fleet. It was 1:50 in the morning on August 9, 1942, and Captain William Greenman watched in horror as his ship's forward turret exploded. In a fountain of flame and twisted steel, the Battle of Savo Island had begun with the kind of devastating surprise that would leave Iron Bottom Sound littered with the hulks of Allied warships before dawn broke over Guadalcanal. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had been caught completely off guard by the Japanese night attack. His screening force of cruisers, positioned to protect the vulnerable transports unloading supplies for the Marines ashore, had been decimated in less than an hour of savage fighting. The USS Quincy, under Captain Samuel Moore, took a torpedo, amidships that broke her back and sent her sliding beneath the dark waters, with over 300 sailors trapped below decks. According to contemporary reports from the Naval Historical Center, the Japanese force had approached undetected through what would become known as the slot. the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands that allowed for high-speed nighttime approaches, while remaining hidden from aerial reconnaissance during daylight hours. Commander Frederick Reefkohl aboard the USS Vincennes fought desperately to bring his guns to bear, but Mikawa's perfectly executed battle plan had positioned the Japanese cruisers to achieve devastating crossfire against the scattered Allied formation. The heavy cruiser Kako and her sisters poured armor-piercing shells into the American vessels with methodical precision, their superior night fighting training evident in every perfectly aimed salvo. On Henderson Field, Major General Alexander Vandegrift listened to the thunder of naval gunfire with growing dread. The Marine commander understood that his forces were completely dependent on naval support for supplies, ammunition, and reinforcement. If Turner's fleet was destroyed, the 18,000 Marines on Guadalcanal would be stranded with whatever ammunition and rations they had managed to unload before the attack began. Captain Bode of the USS Chicago made the agonizing decision to withdraw his damaged vessel rather than continue the fight, a choice that would haunt him for the remainder of his shortened life. The withdrawal left the northern approach to the anchorage completely undefended, allowing Admiral Mikawa to position his ships for a second devastating attack. On the remaining Allied vessels, Lieutenant Commander William Mack, serving aboard the destroyer USS Bagley, witnessed the destruction of the heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra as Australian Captain Frank Getting tried desperately to save his burning ship. The Canberra's crew fought the flames with a courage that impressed even their enemies, but the damage was too severe, and she would have to be scuttled by Allied destroyers before the next Japanese air attack could claim her as a prize. By dawn, for Allied heavy cruisers lay at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, and Admiral Turner was forced to withdraw his remaining vessels, along with the critically needed supplies still aboard the transports. The Marines on Guadalcanal found themselves in possession of an airfield they could not adequately defend, with ammunition for perhaps 2 weeks of sustained fighting, and no clear timeline for resupply or reinforcement. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, a native Solomon Islander serving as a scout for the Marines, brought disturbing intelligence from the interior of the island. Japanese forces were moving through the jungle in significant numbers, and their discipline and equipment suggested regular Army troops rather than the construction workers the Marines had initially encountered. The real battle for Guadalcanal was about to begin, and the outcome was far from certain. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's face was a mask of controlled fury as he studied the American defensive positions through his field glasses. It was August 19, 1942, and the veteran Japanese commander could not comprehend how his elite troops had been stopped by what appeared to be a hastily constructed sandbar fortification along the Tanaru River. His 916th Infantry Regiment had been promised an easy victory against demoralized American forces, but the reality facing him bore no resemblance to the intelligence briefings he had received in Rabaul. The attack had begun at 0300 hours with the traditional banzai charge that had terrorized Allied forces throughout the Pacific campaign. Over 900 Japanese soldiers had emerged from the jungle darkness, screaming war cries and brandishing bayonets as they rushed toward the Marine positions. Colonel Clifton Cates, commanding the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, had waited until the attackers were less than 50 yards from his wire before giving the order to open fire. Private First Class John Rivers, manning a Browning automatic rifle in the center of the Marine line, had never seen anything like the human wave that crashed against their positions. The Japanese soldiers came forward in successive waves, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades with a fanaticism that defied rational military doctrine. But the Marines had prepared their positions with overlapping fields of fire, and the slaughter that followed would haunt both sides for the remainder of the campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell brought his Stuart tanks forward at dawn to finish what the infantry had begun. The light tanks churned through the sand and palm logs of the Japanese positions, their tracks grinding over wounded enemy soldiers who lacked the strength to crawl clear. War correspondent Richard Trigaskis, embedded with the Marines, would later write that the scene resembled something from Dante's Inferno rather than a conventional military engagement. Colonel Ichiki himself died in the final assault, leading his remaining 100 men in a desperate charge against Marine positions that had been reinforced during the night. Major General Kyote Kawaguchi, observing the battle from his headquarters several miles inland, realized that American defensive capabilities had been drastically underestimated by Imperial headquarters. The easy victory promised by his superiors was transforming into a costly attritional nightmare. Captain Charles Brush, leading the reconnaissance patrol that had first detected Ichiki's advance, counted over 800 Japanese bodies scattered across the battlefield when the fighting finally ended. The Marine casualties numbered fewer than 50 killed and wounded, a disparity so extreme that initial reports were questioned by senior commanders, who suspected the numbers had been inflated for propaganda purposes. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, who had been captured and tortured by Ichiki's troops before escaping to warn the Marines of the impending attack, required extensive medical treatment for bayonet wounds that should have killed him. The Solomon Islanders' courage under torture and his successful escape through miles of enemy-controlled jungle would earn him the Silver Star and the lasting respect of every Marine who served on Guadalcanal. The victory at Tanaru River provided a crucial morale boost for the Marines, but intelligence reports suggested that Colonel Ichiki's regiment had been merely the advance guard of a much larger Japanese force moving through the island's interior. Major General Alexander Vandegrift understood that his men had passed their first major test, but the enemy's willingness to sacrifice an entire regiment in a frontal assault suggested that future attacks would be both larger in scale and more tactically sophisticated. As burial details worked through the humid afternoon heat, disposing of Japanese bodies that were already beginning to decompose in the tropical climate, veteran Marines like Gunnery Sergeant John Basalone wondered if they possessed sufficient ammunition and supplies to withstand the larger attacks that were certainly coming. The enemy had demonstrated a capacity for fanatical sacrifice that exceeded anything they had encountered in their previous Pacific campaigns. The rain fell in torrents as Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, positioned his raiders along the razor-sharp coral ridge that would soon bear his name. It was September 12, 1942, and the veteran Marine commander could sense the gathering storm that had nothing to do with the tropical weather hammering Guadalcanal. Intelligence reports indicated that Major General Kyote Kawaguchi was moving over 6,000 Japanese troops through the jungle for a coordinated assault on Henderson Field, and Edson's 800 raiders represented the primary obstacle to enemy success. The Japanese bombardment began at sunset, with destroyers from Admiral Reizo Tanaka's Tokyo Express pounding the Marine positions with 5-inch shells that turned the coral ridge into a moonscape of craters and shattered palm trees. Corporal Walter Burek, crouched in a hastily dug fighting hole, watched in fascination as enemy shells walked steadily closer to his position, each explosion showering him with coral fragments that cut through his utilities like shrapnel. Major Kenneth Bailey led the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, in a fighting withdrawal as Kawaguchi's troops pressed their attack with unprecedented coordination and tactical sophistication. Unlike the suicidal banzai charges of the Tanaru River battle, these Japanese soldiers advanced by fire and maneuver, using covering fire and infiltration tactics that forced the Marines to give ground repeatedly throughout the night of September 13th. According to battlefield reports preserved in the Marine Corps' Historical Division archives, the fighting reached such intensity that individual Marines were engaging enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat while artillery shells from both sides exploded among the combatants. Private First Class Joseph Champagne found himself alone in his fighting position when a Japanese infiltration team overran his squad's sector of the perimeter. Armed with only his M1 Garand and to-hand grenades, the young Marine held his position for over 3 hours, calling artillery fire on his own coordinates twice to break up enemy assault formations. His actions would earn him the Navy Cross posthumously, as his body was found surrounded by 17 dead Japanese soldiers. Captain William McKinnon brought his artillery forward to point-blank range, firing over open sights into Japanese formations. that had penetrated to within 200 yards of Henderson Field. The 105th Artillery Battalion's 105mm howitzers fired continuously throughout the night, their crews working by feel in the darkness as enemy snipers picked off anyone who showed himself above the gun shields. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, still recovering from his wounds sustained during the Tanaru River fighting, volunteered to lead a patrol into the Japanese rear areas to gather intelligence on enemy troop movements. The Solomon Islanders' knowledge of the jungle terrain proved invaluable, as he guided Marine patrols through routes that avoided Japanese observation posts and ambush positions established along the more obvious approaches to the battlefield. The crisis came just before dawn on September 14th, when Colonel Kawaguchi committed his reserve battalion in a final assault that penetrated to within yards of the Henderson Field runway. Major Robert Hill rallied stragglers from 3 different Marine units into an improvised defensive line that held just long enough for reinforcements from the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines to counterattack and restore the perimeter. As sunrise revealed the extent of the carnage, Corpsman John Bradley moved among the wounded of both sides, providing medical aid without regard to nationality. The young Navy medic would later recall that the Japanese wounded displayed the same courage under fire that had made their assault so terrifyingly effective, refusing morphine and insisting that American wounded be treated first despite their own severe injuries. The Battle of Bloody Ridge cost the Japanese over 1,200 casualties, including many of the veteran NCOs and junior officers who formed the backbone of their infantry units. Major General Kawaguchi's carefully planned assault had failed, but the Marines had been pushed to the very limits of their endurance, and everyone on both sides understood that the decisive battle for Guadalcanal was yet to come. Admiral William Bull Halsey's weathered hands gripped the bridge rail of the USS Enterprise as he watched Japanese aircraft swarm toward his task force like angry hornets. It was October 26, 1942, and the newly appointed South Pacific commander understood that the next few hours would determine whether American forces could maintain their precarious foothold on Guadalcanal. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was about to test both fleets to their breaking points in a carrier duel that would leave the Pacific Ocean littered with burning aircraft and sinking warships. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force from his flagship Shokaku, had learned bitter lessons from his defeats at Coral Sea and Midway. This time his pilots would not be caught off guard by American fighters, and his attack formations included enough escort fighters to ensure that his bombers reached their targets. The veteran Japanese admiral watched with professional satisfaction as his aircraft climbed toward their attack altitude, their engines synchronized in the distinctive harmony that Japanese aviators called the Song of Victory. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, leading Fighting Squadron 10 from the USS Enterprise, intercepted the first wave of Japanese attackers over the destroyer screen. At 0-8-40-5 hours, the aerial combat that followed exceeded anything seen in the Pacific War to that point, with over 100 aircraft engaged in a swirling dogfight that stretched across 50 miles of ocean. Ensign George Wren, flying his first combat mission, found himself alone against 3 Japanese Zero fighters and somehow survived long enough to shoot down 2 of them before his damaged Wildcat forced him to ditch in the ocean. The Japanese attack on the Enterprise was pressed home with a determination that impressed even veteran American sailors who had survived Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki led his dive bomber squadron through intense anti-aircraft fire to place 3 bombs directly on the carrier's flight deck, starting fires that threatened the ship's aviation fuel storage areas, and forced damage control teams to flood the forward magazines as a precautionary measure. Captain Osborne Hardison aboard the destroyer Porter watched in horror as a Japanese submarine's torpedo split his ship in half amidships. The USS Porter had been screening the carriers when the I-21 achieved a perfect firing solution, and her crew had less than 8 minutes to abandon ship before she rolled over and disappeared beneath the Pacific swells. 115 sailors died in the attack, including many who had survived the initial torpedo hit but were trapped below decks. When the ship's electrical system failed, historical records maintained by the Naval War College indicate that both fleets suffered such severe losses during the Santa Cruz engagement that neither side could claim a clear tactical victory. Though the strategic implications heavily favored the Japanese forces, Major General Alexander Vandegrift, monitoring the naval battle from his command post on Henderson Field, realized that his Marines were witnessing the decisive moment of the Guadalcanal campaign. If Halsey's carriers were destroyed or forced to withdraw, the Japanese would achieve naval supremacy in the Solomon Islands, making resupply and reinforcement of the Marine garrison impossible. The sounds of distant explosions carried across the water like thunder from a storm. That would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, one of Japan's leading fighter aces, died when his damaged Zero fighter crashed into the sea while attempting to return to the Shokaku. His death represented the kind of irreplaceable loss that was slowly bleeding the Japanese naval air arm of its most experienced pilots, men whose skills could not be quickly replaced. Despite the Empire's desperate need for veteran aviators, the USS Hornet, under Captain Charles Mason, absorbed for bomb hits and to torpedo strikes before her crew was forced to abandon ship. The carrier's death throes stretched over 8 hours as damage control teams fought desperately to save their ship, but the combined effects of fire, flooding, and structural damage eventually proved overwhelming. The Hornet would be the last American fleet carrier lost in the Pacific War, her sacrifice buying time for the massive shipbuilding program that would soon tip the naval balance irreversibly in America's favor. As darkness fell over the battle area, both fleets withdrew to assess their losses and tend their wounded. But the strategic situation had subtly shifted in favor of the Americans. Despite their tactical defeat, the thunder of Japanese naval guns shook Henderson Field like an earthquake as the battleships Congo and Haruna pounded the Marine positions with 14-inch shells that cratered the runway and set fire to everything within a mile radius. It was October 14, 1942, and Major General Alexander Vandegrift crouched in his command bunker as high explosive rounds landed with the regularity of a metronome, each impact sending shock waves through the coral soil that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe had brought his bombardment force within 25,000 yards of the American perimeter, close enough for his battleship gunners to target individual buildings and aircraft, revetments with devastating precision. The Japanese admiral understood that Henderson Field was the key to controlling Guadalcanal, and his orders from Imperial headquarters were explicit: destroy the airfield and eliminate its capacity to support American air operations in the Solomon Islands. Captain Marion Carl, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 221, watched helplessly as Japanese shells systematically destroyed his precious Wildcat fighters. Each aircraft represented months of irreplaceable pilot training and mechanical expertise that could not be quickly replaced, and Carl knew that losing his squadron would leave the Marines without air cover for the crucial battles ahead. Technical Sergeant John Faulkner worked frantically to roll damaged aircraft into revetments that might provide some protection from the naval bombardment, but the intensity of the shelling made movement across the airfield suicidal. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuzo led his native scouts through the jungle to establish observation posts that could provide early warning of Japanese ground attacks coordinated with the naval bombardment. The Solomon Islander had developed an uncanny ability to predict enemy movements based on subtle changes in jungle sounds and animal behavior, skills that had already saved Marine lives. During previous Japanese assaults on the perimeter, the bombardment continued for over 2 hours, with the Japanese battleships firing more than 900 rounds of heavy ammunition into the American positions. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, recently arrived to take command of the Cactus Air Force, surveyed the damage at first light and realized that his pilots would be operating from a runway that resembled a lunar landscape more than a functional airfield. Bomb craters filled with stagnant water provided breeding grounds for malaria-carrying mosquitoes, while unexploded Japanese shells scattered across the field posed a constant threat to aircraft and personnel, according to military records preserved in the National Archives. The October 14th bombardment represented the heaviest concentration of naval gunfire directed against a land target in the Pacific War to that point, exceeding even the preparatory bombardments conducted before major amphibious assaults. Private First Class Mitchell Page manned his machine gun position along the southern perimeter as Japanese infantry probes tested the Marine defenses throughout. The night following the naval bombardment, the young Marine had arrived on Guadalcanal as a replacement just 2 weeks earlier, but the intensity of combat on the island had aged him beyond his 22 years. His parents' letters from home seemed to describe a different world, one where the greatest concerns involved rationing and war bond drives, rather than survival against an enemy who showed no quarter. Major Robert Hill coordinated the defense of Sector 7 as Colonel Masao Maruyama's Sendai Division launched their main assault through the jungle approaches that had been carefully scouted. During the preceding weeks, the Japanese attack came in multiple waves, each preceded by mortar barrages that forced the Marines to keep their heads down, while enemy infantry closed a grenade range of the American positions. The crisis peaked around midnight when Japanese infiltration teams penetrated the Marine perimeter in 3 separate locations, forcing Vandegrift to commit his last reserves to prevent a complete breakthrough. Captain James Foss led a desperate counterattack that sealed one penetration, but the fighting was so intense that individual Marines found themselves engaging enemy soldiers with entrenching tools and bayonets when their ammunition ran low. As dawn broke over Henderson Field, the Marines had held their positions, but the cost had been enormous, and everyone understood that the Japanese would return with even larger forces. Once they had regrouped and resupplied their assault units, the USS Washington's 16-inch guns illuminated the night with tongues of flame that reached across Iron Bottom Sound. Like the wrath of an angry god, it was November 14th, 1942, and Admiral Willis Lee had positioned his battleship task force to intercept Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's powerful surface fleet in what would become the decisive naval engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. The fate of Henderson Field, and perhaps the entire Pacific War, would be determined by the accuracy of American gunfire in the next crucial hour. Captain Glenn Davis ordered his gun crews to concentrate their fire on the Japanese battleship Kirishima, whose 14-inch guns posed the greatest threat to the American formation. The Washington's radar-directed fire control represented a technological advantage that the Japanese could not match, allowing Davis's gunners to achieve devastating accuracy despite the darkness and smoke that shrouded the battlefield. Chief Petty Officer Robert Sinclair, directing the fire of turret number 2, watched through his OPTICAL rangefinder as American shells struck the Japanese vessel with mechanical precision. Admiral Kondo had planned his attack to coincide with the final Japanese ground assault on Henderson Field, expecting that his battleship bombardment would finish what Major General Harukichi Hayakutaka's 38th Division had begun. The Japanese admiral commanded a formidable force including the battleship Kirishima, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, more than sufficient firepower to reduce the Marine airfield to rubble if his ships could approach within effective gun range. The destroyer USS Preston, under Commander Max Storms, died in the opening minutes of the engagement, when Japanese cruiser fire turned her into a blazing wreck that illuminated the entire battle area. Her crew fought to save their ship until the end, but the damage was too severe, and she rolled over and sank with the loss of 117 sailors, who had volunteered for what they knew would be a desperate mission against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless aboard the USS San Francisco coordinated damage control effort as Japanese shells systematically destroyed his cruiser's superstructure and killed most of the senior officers on the bridge. The young officer found himself in command of the heavy cruiser during the most intense phase of the battle, making tactical decisions that would determine whether his ship survived the night or joined her sisters at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The tide of battle turned when the Washington's guns found their target. With devastating effect, the Kirishima pride of the Japanese battle fleet, absorbed multiple direct hits from American 16-inch shells that penetrated her armor, and started fires that could be seen for miles across the dark waters of the Solomon Sea. Captain Sanji Iwabuchi fought desperately to save his ship, but the damage was too extensive, and he was forced to order abandon ship as uncontrolled flooding threatened to capsize the battleship. According to official Navy records housed at the Naval Historical Center, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal marked the first time in the Pacific War that American surface ships had defeated a Japanese fleet in a night engagement, traditionally considered Japan's area of tactical superiority. Major General Alexander Vandegrift watched the distant gun flashes from his command post and understood that the naval battle would determine whether his Marines could hold Henderson Field through the dawn. If Admiral Lee's ships were destroyed, the Japanese would achieve naval supremacy and could land reinforcements at will, while preventing American resupply efforts. The Marines had ammunition for perhaps 48 hours of sustained fighting, insufficient to withstand a prolonged siege without naval support. Seaman First Class Calvin Graham, serving aboard the USS South Dakota despite being only 16 years old, manned his battle station as Japanese shells bracketed his battleship. Throughout the engagement, the teenager had lied about his age to enlist after Pearl Harbor, and his courage under fire would earn him a Bronze Star before Navy investigators discovered his true age and discharged him from active duty. As the Japanese fleet withdrew in the early morning hours of November 15th, leaving the Kirishima burning and sinking in Iron Bottom Sound, both sides understood that the Guadalcanal campaign had reached its turning point. The Americans had finally achieved the naval superiority necessary to maintain their positions on the island, while Japanese losses in ships and experienced crews had reached levels that could not be sustained without compromising operations. Throughout the Pacific theater, the bloody 6-month campaign that began with an unopposed Marine landing had evolved into the decisive battle that would determine whether American forces could maintain their offensive momentum or be forced back into a defensive posture that might prolong the Pacific War for years. Henderson Field remained in American hands, but the cost in ships, aircraft, and human lives had been staggering for both sides, earning Guadalcanal its grim nickname as the Island of Death.